This is our teaching video for the fifth Sunday after Epiphany, February the 8th, 2015. In our video today, we return to the town of Capernaum, and last week you may remember that Jesus was in the synagogue healing. He's going to continue healing, this time out of the synagogue in the house of Simon Peter and his mother-in-law. We're going to take just a brief little tour of some ancient Christian graffiti, some of it anti-Christian, some of it pro-Christian, and that's an interesting archaeological way to explore symbols of faith from long ago. Also to enter the context of the Greco-Roman world in early Christianity. And then finally we're going to look a little bit at the Babylonian Empire during the time of the exile and almost the end of the Babylonian Empire when they're taken over by the Persians, as we look at the context of Isaiah 40. So the synagogue in which Jesus did his healing in Capernaum, the ruins are still there for you to visit on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so here they are if you were to go see them today. They're distinguished because the stone used for the building of this synagogue was different than a lot of the stone used to build the houses and the other buildings around it. But it's this very place where Jesus stood and healed the person with the unclean spirit last week. Now, Capernaum wasn't a very big town, maybe 1,500 people. And if we were going to go down the street from the synagogue, we would come to the ruins of this home, which is the home of Simon Peter, where Jesus goes in the Gospel this Sunday to heal his mother-in-law of a fever. And so you can see actually various layers of archaeological exploration, and it's not uncommon, right, for the ancient world and then another group to come and build on top of that and build on top of that. And so actually they had to dig through several layers of Christian history, the Byzantines and all that, to get to the original building that Simon Peter built and lived in. Now you may see a little bit of a structure or a shadow over this, and that's because on top of this house of Simon Peter is a gigantic church. Peter's house wasn't fully excavated until the 1960s, and so it's not surprising that the church is a modern-looking church. They literally built it over the ruins while keeping the ruins intact, and so were you to go inside this church, you could actually look through a glass partition in the floor and see the house where Peter lived. Now, one of the problems of showing you just pictures is we don't necessarily get the distance or the context. So the synagogue and Peter's home are actually very close together. And we might say it's great to have the proximity between a home and the church, if not physically, at least spiritually. And we might say that the home of Peter is even closer than the parsonage of our church to the church building. Just to show that, there's the ruins of the synagogue that I showed you, and then there's the church that I showed you, and then there's the Sea of Galilee. So all of this stuff kind of packed right one on top of each other in the small fishing village in which Jesus launches his ministry in the Gospel of Mark. And if you remember, he announces the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is near, and part of the kingdom's power being shown to the people is that they are cleansed from illness and unclean spirits. And that distinction is important, as I told you on Sunday. Not all illness is caused by unclean spirits, and not all unclean spirits cause illness. And so we'll hear that Jesus does a healing of both. Now, one of the things I mentioned is that when they went and excavated Peter's house back in the 60s, one of the things they came across is that people had scratched Greek words into the walls, literally Christian graffiti. And there's actually a whole host of Christian graffiti that's been found all over the ancient Roman world. Some of it pro-Christian, some of it anti-Christian. And what I'm going to show you now is probably the most famous anti-Christian. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the interesting ways that people would use words and numbers to leave graffiti in the ancient world. This is a famous graffiti or graffito that appeared in Rome, and it had been in a building belonging to Caligula, and after Caligula died it turned into a boarding school, and it's probably not surprising that a boys' school there'd be lots of graffiti. But you see a very rudimentary scratched into the wall, and it is scratched into stone, so that's not necessarily easy. You see a young man, and then you see a human figure with a donkey head, and then a bar across his shoulders. And so actually what we would see here is the cross shape, so this would be the cross. This is actually a figure of Jesus with a donkey head. One of the ways that people would popularly mock Christians and Jews was to say that they worshipped a donkey. And so there's actually a lot of instances where ancient Romans would make fun of Christians and Jesus would be represented having a donkey head. And then here it says Alexamenos worships his god, and so here's this Alexamenos, one of the students in the school, worshipping his donkey-headed Christ. And so this is an early graffito that goes back centuries to the early church that's negative, but it also captures some of the real responses to this faith and this kingdom that's spreading. Now, if you remember, the Arabic numerals that we're familiar with, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., these only appeared in the Western world 1,000 years ago, a little over 1,000 years ago, and those had been introduced by the famous mathematician Fibonacci. Before we had the Arabic numerals, letters were numeric. And so it's interesting, if you look at ancient graffiti, and if you look at just ancient writing, they were always interested in matching the values of words and meanings of words. So, for example, in Greek, and I'm not going to use the Greek letters, but kurios means Lord, and the word pistis means faith. And so in some of the graffiti, people would intentionally put these two words together because their numerical value in Greek both equals 800. And so there's this sense of finding a numerical symmetry in the words that people would use. And of course, this was done on the street, but it was also done in poetry and in politics and in writing. There's a very famous one about Nero, and it's Nero and he kills his mother. And so one of the ways that this was written is the value of Nero and the value of he kills his mother were identical, meaning that contained within Nero and his character was the ability of matricide, which is part of his story. Of course, Nero is very famous too in the book of Revelation for 666, and that's where that name comes from. So this is probably something totally bizarre and foreign to us, but in another time there was a sense of mathematically, symmetrically connecting the words that were used, the meaning that was used, and finding a literal equilibrium between the value of words. And so one of the things we see in some more sophisticated Christian graffiti is this practice from Greek culture. Now, one of the interesting things is if you were going to go to Pompeii, there are lots of graffiti that does the same thing, but this is very sort of street graffiti. And so someone will say something like, I am in love with the woman whose name is 545. And so rather than spelling out her name and revealing himself, he simply reveals the numeric value of her name. And this is some stuff that's still embedded in the Bible, because this culture is the culture that wrote the Bible. Though for us, and especially because we use the Arabic numbers and have for 1,000 years, this is something that's probably just referred to mystic speculation, whereas before it was something contained simply within the culture. Alright, well, for the last couple minutes of this video, we want to talk about the Babylonians. One of the readings we're going to have on Sunday is from Isaiah 40, and Isaiah 40 is the announcement of God's promise of return. So, if you remember, we had the Assyrian Empire, which is this sort of reddish color here, and then the Assyrians were taken over by a new Babylonian Empire, which is this dotted line here. And so in terms of the Bible's history, there are a lot of prophets that write against the Assyrians because they destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And then, of course, Babylon becomes this huge character in the book of Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel, the book of Nehemiah, the book of Ezra. All of these books end up dealing with the exile into Babylon and its effects. Here's a map of the route the exiles probably took. So the Babylonians came and they destroyed the temple in 587 BC, and then they led the upper crust of the culture into exile in Babylon. So they left a lot of people behind, but the people they thought might get them into trouble or make it difficult to rule, they resettled in Babylon. And so of course you see that this circuitous route, as I've told you before, is the route you have to take because it follows the water. So Abraham, when he went to the promised land, went that way. When the people go back, they follow the same route. And we might say that's the great tragedy. Abraham, who walks with the promise, walks all the way here, and then his people have to walk all the way back because of their unfaithfulness. Of course, the famous king in that time, King Nebuchadnezzar, here's a picture of the great Ishtar Gate in Babylon. And of course, this is a computer model. But it's something they dug up, at least the inner gate, and they put in a museum in Berlin. So if you went to the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, you could see the Ishtar Gate recreated. And so it's a sign that the Babylonian Empire was something great, something magnificent, something that was luxurious and powerful. And what God's going to say on Sunday is, yeah, the Babylonians are big, but I'm even bigger. Do not be afraid. I will lead you home. We'll see you Sunday.